After all this, you still...
I still want that gas, yes. And you had better deliver.
I'll tell you one thing though, watching this movie when like the Taylor Swift concert and like Five Nights at Freddy's is out. Like you see the meme where like the scene's going on and you have the audio from both like things going on at the same time. No joke.
I haven't seen that, no.
Okay, because I was literally in like when I went to see it, the theater next to us was like doing the Taylor Swift tour or whatever, and like in all like these dramatic and poignant scenes, I just hear like pop music like vaguely through the wall. I'm just like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
Then I realized what was going on. But I mean, it didn't take me out of the immersion too much, but I was just like, what?
You know, yeah, there was, now that you mention it, I do recall when I saw this, there was like a lot of just ambient sound from like, you know, just like what sounded like thunder and stuff like that. And sometimes that was the movie, but it was just like you could hear like, you know, just kind of like a lot of noise coming, like just like the shaking of the walls and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, because I think it's like what? It's this movie. We've got the Taylor Swift Eras tour, and then like I think all the other blockbusters have kind of cleared at this point, right? And this one's even been out for like a week and a half at this point.
Yeah, this has been out for a week and a half. I'm trying to think what's coming. This weekend, I believe, or not this weekend, but next weekend is The Marvels, so it's going to have to compete with Scorsese's favorite.
And we're already seeing how that beef is playing out. Oh boy. I will say, this Thanksgiving, I'm putting the turkey down. I will be in theaters watching Napoleon.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to that one.
In full French army regalia, I will.
Just get the full cosplay out.
The full cost.
You gotta make sure you have the hat. Preferably you're sitting in the back of the theater at that point, but you know, maybe in true French style, you sit up front and get in as many people's way as possible.
I don't know, because like that's how you get like I don't understand how like we're at the apex of human technology and we still haven't figured out how to make screens look normal that close up front.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of like a sort of laziness when it comes to like the development of certain things. We're just like, yeah, it's good enough. We don't need to necessarily try the rest of that stuff. Yeah,
they say capitalism fosters innovation. Well, guess what? I haven't seen any innovation on this front. The market's been free for a minute.
That's true.
Oh boy. Welcome back to the Greenhouse, dear listeners. It's me and Josh for our movie magic segment. I've been very excited to cover this one. We will be getting into Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, as always. Content warning. In true cinema fashion, I have a very pretentious set of opening remarks I wrote for this. Before I get into this, is there anything you wanted to open with?
No, but I mean, I was going to say pretentious, like openings and whatnot is, I mean, it's kind of the theme of the movie itself. So it makes sense that this is how we choose to open.
All right. Well, we're returning to the greenhouse in strange conditions as usual. The world remains mired in conflict abroad as well as domestically. The world grows hotter, the corrupt become more emboldened, and the U.S. empire is now more brittle. The waning age of the alleged American empire is not one that inspires a more hopeful or peaceful future, but one that inspires fear, uncertainty, and unfortunately, violence. This current age, in the accidentally wise words of Vice President Kamala Harris, exists in the context of all that it is and all that came before. We vaguely explored this idea in past episodes that when it is difficult or impossible to demand or deliver justice, it is incumbent on us to examine the ledger of history and bring to light the record of past injustice and explain to the world how and why these past injustices are tied to, if not the justification for today's injustices. This may not have been the pure interest or drive behind the work we're discussing today, but this remains one great property of art and cinema that must be understood and channeled. Today, we'll be discussing Martin Scorsese's recent film, which I personally consider to be a brilliant movie, Killers of the Flower Moon. So, first impressions. What did you think of the film?
So I thought it was pretty good. I think the one thing that kind of stands out, and like not to like just be like kind of, you know, the basic bitch complaint, but it is very long, and I don't necessarily think it needed to be. I think it's sort of the movie is sort of like, and not that I'm like, you know, you need to pick a lane or genre and stick with it, but the movie sort of veers in and out of multiple genres. There's sort of like this murder mystery thing, and then there's like a movie about, you know, we know the mystery's solved like halfway through, like we know who's doing it, and then we kind of delve into it, but then like we have to get confirmations later about things. There's the courtroom drama stuff. There's a lot going on, and I don't think it was all essential to telling this particular story. Especially when like the story itself is kind of like, I mean, this is about a relatively you know, interesting historical phenomenon with the Osage murders in this era, and this is just focusing on like a handful of them, and there was a lot more than just the handful that we see in this movie. There was like a big like endemic of this happening at the time, beyond just what we saw with like, you know, the was it the Burkharts and you know, King Hill and whatnot. So this is, I appreciated it. I just think that it was a little long. The you probably have some thoughts about the way it ends with the like mystery science theater type you know ending, where if it's like, you know, this what's the exact term for it, but the ending for that too. I don't know if that was an essential way to end it. Maybe there's some stylistic thing for it, and I think that I think I get the stylistic reason for it, and I think it helps deliver a different message, but it did feel like it was a little overly long, and a few things like that kind of held it back from like being a true instant classic. But I still think it was a very good movie.
Yeah, I think I did notice that like there were shifting perspectives, and I guess because I enjoyed it, I didn't consider that it could be disorienting for some viewers. So it's good you mentioned that. There are like clear perspective shifts, especially like certain scenes in the movie or certain points in the film where you can tell like this is one character's perspective of events versus another's. Sure. And like those, it's a lot more obvious than it is in some other films. And like I personally like the effect. But I guess I didn't even consider like how that could be disorienting for some viewers. And then with regards to the length, like that's a point we discussed in Oppenheimer too, right? Where like we've this year is unique in that like one blockbuster has already been willing to stretch the duration of what we commonly consider acceptable in like modern films, right? And I think like, you know, to me, who like grew up with like Bollywood films, right, which are notorious for long run times, intermissions are kind of baked into the film viewing process. You know, like the cultural expectation of going to a film is like there will be a 10-minute or 15-minute intermission. You're gonna go, you know, take care of your needs, go get like some more like concessions, come back to the film relaxed, and then, you know, enjoy the rest of your movie, right? And that probably was the case for American films at once upon a time. I don't know what the profit motive or what like the industry reason is for shorter film runtimes. Probably to like get more showings. That might be it. That might be it, right? But like this was a new controversy about this film, right? Is that
Yeah, I was gonna say, you mentioned the intermission thing, and there was actually like a lawsuit involved with this movie about some theaters actually including an intermission.
Right, and it's like the artistic intent was to watch it all in one sitting, and like that is a, you know, a consideration for a film, right? Like I guess, you know, for Oppenheimer, Nolan didn't really say one way or another whether there should or shouldn't have been an intermission, and I didn't even consider like, does an intermission affect your viewing experience? I don't know. I'm not that deep into film Twitter and being that much of a film head that I could decisively say that. But I guess, the intent to watch like a nearly 4-hour film in one sitting, that's a lot to ask for like the modern, like, consumer of film who's used to like an hour and a half, 2 hours max. But I think like the artistic intent of having it be 4 hours and like we were able to survive the viewing, right, is I think it's to really like wear you down emotionally and put you in the state of mind that some of the characters are in. And if that's the intent, I can see it.
And I have some thoughts on that and whether or not I thought they did it in a good way for like I think, but we'll kind of get into that, right? I think the way certain characters were portrayed, I don't. There might be some problems with it that at least I personally have.
Okay. Yeah, because it's like, Scorsese films tend to run on the longer side anyways, right? And it's like,
yeah,
I never heard this intent that like, oh, you should have watched The Irishman in one sitting.
Yeah,
you could do it. I took breaks,
I haven't watched that one yet. My brother just gave it such a like apocalyptic review that I just didn't want to like. I never decided to like buckle up for it because he fell asleep like partway through and he's just like, and he got up. He's like, dude, like this is just so like. He's like, I wasn't even tired. So I don't know, but I mean, this one is. I think it was definitely like. I mean, it was a survivable experience, of course. I think some concessions could have been made. I think that like there's, I appreciate like getting like just the director's cut is like the only version of a film that you get, but at the same time, I kind of there's some considerations that make having a shorter movie be maybe a little bit more desirable in certain cases.
Possibly. So David Grann's book, Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI was the inspiration for the film. I didn't have a chance to read it. What I am aware of, but what I am aware of is like pretty much as soon as the book was published or like right before, there was a big bidding war for like the film rights, and Scorsese is who won that. And I think like definitely after watching this, I can see why someone would be drawn to like wanting those film rights so bad and retelling this story. From what I have heard about the book, I did hear it's like a little bit of like a pro cop kind of vibe. Because it is trying to cover like the birth of the FBI, but again, I haven't read the book, so I'm not going to speculate.
I mean, I can maybe see some shades of it in the movie itself, right? I mean, it's like I don't think that like pro cop was like the thesis of the movie by any stretch, but I did get the impression, right, that like it portrays the FBI in probably the most positive light I've seen the FBI portrayed in like any movie,
right?
Right, like they're the ones that are actually able to like solve these murders and actually help people that had been like ignored, and like the whole system was literally rigged against them in every possible fashion.
Yeah, and I think like as a Scorsese head, right, like his specialty is crime cinema. He's great at telling crime cinema, right? So there's like a line in The Sopranos I think about sometimes where it's like his therapist is confronting him about his criminal activities.
Yeah.
And he basically responds with, well, what about the robber barons? They were 10 times worse than us. Like, I'm paraphrasing. And then you kind of basically see that writ large in the film where it's like these posses are like marauding, raunchy, rowdy guys just like, living on this land with impunity and getting up to heinous shit. And it's like, you kind of wonder like, what's the dividing line between these guys and like the mob who are traditionally Scorsese's, focus in film.
Yeah.
And you can see some parallels there. You can also see like, I guess like we talk about like colonizing the Wild West as this formal activity, right? but in a practical sense, like it probably was carried out in a pretty criminal fashion with like, you know, multiple events like this. And like also the event, I mean, the Tulsa race massacre gets brought up in this film, right? And that was part of like a larger wave of basically racial pogroms against black people in a series called The Red Summer, which is part of the Red Scare.
Yeah, and it's really interesting kind of seeing this, like, you know, seeing it mentioned here, right? Because I think, you know, oftentimes, and I mentioned this with Oppenheimer as well, there's a lot of like these historical eras that like people don't really process that like all of these things were sort of happening at the same time.
Yeah.
They weren't in isolation. And I think it's really interesting seeing like the movie, like, you know, like, oh yeah, Tulsa, like, oh wait, Tulsa was like, you know, there was still like sort of like this, you know, Native American oppression thing. Like at that point, like when you've like kind of like pieced together the history like in your mind without having the dates, you kind of think like, oh well, like, you know, Wild West has already been like thoroughly conquered at that point, right? They're all off on the reservation, completely oppressed and whatnot. And you see that there's like, oh, there was a little bit of that still going on here, but it's interesting seeing that overall, like, you know, seeing those parallel lines like drawn where it's like, oh, all of this is happening at the same time and whatnot.
Yeah, and even like the early setting, right, is like you got Ernest Burkhart coming back after World War One.
Yeah,
you know, Calvin Coolidge is there for like a scene, right? It's in an era that like in our popular conception of history we would consider as like, you know, the early modern era, right? Like at least pre World War One, people think it's pretty developed, but they go to a historical period in a geographic space that is a lot closer to the Wild West than we would initially think, right? And it also just like as you were mentioning, like there's just all these eras within just American history alone, these events, these disparate periods, these areas of geographic historical study, right, that are so poorly understood in the popular narrative that are worth our study and attention. It was kind of reminding me, like one of the examples tangential to this that this makes me think of is like Louisiana was probably like the last state in the Union to be or at least in the continental United States, to be connected to the like electric grid.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it took like Huey Long, you know, and that was like FDR era stuff, right? So it's like you know, we think that like, well, America must have been like a fully developed country by like the 30s. Probably not.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And like, you know, I mean, this is just, you know, when we think of World War One, we definitely think of it much more industrial United States,
exactly,
than what you're seeing here.
No, for sure. And I think like that's why like that, again, not to bring up our usual political discussion on this program, right? But that regional theory of power in American history and politics, right? It is like, you know, dictated by like the Midwestern cities and the Northeast being this massive industrial hub. And then even though the shipping and all the ports are on the East Coast too.
Yeah.
All right. That was a good digression, but let's try to get us back in. So with the plot summary, as we mentioned, you know, this film is nearing 4 hours. I don't know if we're going to be able to do like a full plot summary. What I try to do is like structure out our discussion through the different story beats as they come up. And then we'll try to, you know, parse everything through effectively from there. So I guess let's start with the very beginning of the film, right? So what's the significance of that first scene where we see the Osage elders mourn the death of their culture, followed immediately by the discovery of oil on their lands?
Yeah, I mean, I think this it's an important start for the movie, right? I think it sets the whole tone, right? The idea that, and it's a theme that continuously gets brought up, and you know, maybe it's mildly xenophobic, maybe a little bit more justifiably so in this case, considering how they're being treated. But you know, the idea that like, you know, they're getting that encroachment of white people on their culture and whatnot, right? Later in the movie, the mother is concerned, like, you know, sure, her favorite child's like the one that hasn't given birth to any like, you know, mixed race, you know, hasn't diluted the bloodline with, you know, white folks. yet and stuff like that. And you can see this pattern kind of throughout the movie, and I think this really sort of sets the tone for that. And then, of course, the discovery of oil is maybe the clearly it was already this foregone conclusion anyway, so their culture would be put into this place. But the oil discovery, I think, it's an important theme for this, and I think that this required. I think the movie does a good job where, like, if you're smart enough, you can infer the significance the oil and like the head rights that are associated with them have. But the movie doesn't really ever come outright and explain what all of that is and what it means.
Right.
But to kind of give some context, I know this might be slightly out of order with what you had in mind, but
that's fine.
But like the Osage Nation is actually kind of an interesting case for the Native Americans in the sense that they were, I think overall, I think it's probably safe to say they were a lot better off than some of the other nations. They were forced from their ancestral homes, of course, like a lot of the others, but they actually purchased their own reservation land, which is where the movie takes place, right, in Oklahoma. That's their land that they actually purchased rather than just it being like, given as a government pittance. And because that land had oil that, the government wanted, they did get access to it. And they have like all these like oil tycoons using it, but the head rights are sort of this subsidy that's given to these people for it being their land. And there's a lot we can talk about with those and how it relates to even some, modern concepts, right? I mean, Alaska is probably a really good contemporary example where like people are paid a subsidy for living there because of oil and other stuff that's done there for economic productivity.
Yeah, it's like I think I was just trying to do like some cursory reading in anticipation of this, and it's like the Osage getting kicked out of like what was I think like Ohio.
I know they were in Missouri. They mentioned that in the
like
movie
that.
too. They might have had some history there. They notably weren't part of like the like some of the larger like tribal nations and like like they're their own nation. They weren't part of like any of those alliances, like with like the Cherokees and whatnot. So there's that component. Let's see. They developed in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys.
Oh, okay. So that's what, because I think
settled near Missouri and the Mississippi River as a result of Iroquois expansion into the Ohio County in the aftermath of the Beaver Wars. The Beaver Wars. Where's the film rights to that?
There we go. That's cinema. Yeah, I think like another thing too I was looking at is, they did have the ability to purchase their lands, but it's still even today like this bizarre state where the lands are held in trust by the federal government.
Yeah.
So, the head rights system, I don't think you had to do an exposition scene in a movie that long, but the movie does it like expect you to be smart enough to figure out how it works. Where basically it's like all profits and basically all the money that they're entitled to still has to be managed and accounted for by, not to go Alex Jones here, by the nanny state. No, I that's not.
Yeah,
really
that was another component too. There's a little bit of an allusion to it where like Molly has I think she has a guardianship. So she doesn't have unsupervised access, but some people have supervised access. So that was something that happened a little bit later, like in terms of like when these head rights were first given, that wasn't necessarily a feature, but they added this thing because they didn't like the way they were spending their money. So the nanny state, as you put it, sort of takes this role on it. But the head rights, I think they in total account for, if I recall, it's like 10% of like all the money made from oil has to go back to the tribesmen just for, being in that territory.
Yeah. And I think like, again, I said the nanny state joke because it was tongue in cheek, but I think what it really represents, right, is this like legal maneuver by which, the regime of property rights that we call, like, you know, the American bourgeois state, blah 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 blah, you know, is trying to subtly, like, you know, maintain white supremacy in a certain sense, where it's like, okay, you guys struck oil, you guys made it rich, we're not gonna let you have complete impunity, though. You don't get to have the white man's freedom in this sense. And you see that come up in the way certain characters talk about money, wealth, and all of that in the film.
Well, and you know, the way it's discussed in general too, like you get the sense that, like, I mean, obviously, like the guardianship thing is kind of one means of exploitation. They don't really show it that much in the movie. It just sounds like kind of this weird thing where, like, it seems like there's, like, you know, a lack of freedom, and, like, I mean, there is in a lot of ways for people there, but you don't really get the full sense of it. But, like, it was a kind of a financial form of exploitation too, because it was like these lawyers and whatnot were able to sort of, like, tap into some of that money because they were their guardian and stuff like that. And you get the sense, like, from a lot of the businesses in that movie, like, I think all of them, I don't recall seeing a single.
Oh yeah, like from the like the Undertaker to the doctors are all skimming off the top.
Yeah, and I don't think there was a single, like, native-run business that I recall seeing in the movie.
No, not in the movie, no.
But I remember, like, yeah, especially, like, the Undertaker. There's, like, that explicit, like, scene with Ernest where he's, like, saying, like, you're charging me Osage money. So, like, there's, like, very clearly there people taking advantage of this, and you could see, like, where there's the rush, like, early on in the movie for, like, you know, these drivers and whatnot, eager, and, like, people taking pictures and stuff like that. Like, all of these businesses that come across, like, very much like con artists and stuff like that, even when they're providing an actual service, you really see, like, this sense of, like, just desire to, like, hustle as much money as you can from these people. And that's kind of something that you see throughout the entire movie.
Yeah. I also think, like, the movie has this, like, recurring theme of, like, observing and being observed. And in that first scene where, like, the elders are in the tent and having their morning ritual, there's a child who's looking in through, like, a hole in the tent. And I kind of wonder if that's, like, an allusion, like an alluding to this theme, right? Where, like, people will observe things, and how they observe them, their perspective of making that observation, and everything that comes with that, does that paint the truth and how people are treated. We'll see this develop in the discussion, right?
Yeah,
I think that's that probably takes us to our next beat we can get into, and this is kind of an overarching one. So Ernest Burkhart and Hale King's relationship throughout the film. To me, this indicates, you know, an exploration of the idea of control of children by elders and complicity. Also, King's mentality as a cattle rancher seems to apply to all people he deals with. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great and pretty succinct summary of it, right? I mean, definitely you get the impression that, like, King Hale is, you know, like, the cattle business is, like, barely brought up and barely seen. But, you know, he does seem very much like this domineering figure who's treating people, especially the Osage, like cattle, in a very dehumanized way, right? It doesn't necessarily making sure they're kind of all in a row, that they're doing what basically serves his profit motive the most, and that seems to be the main objective. And I think, yeah, you get that, you know, sort of elder and child relationship with him and Ernest throughout the movie, where, like, you know, eventually Ernest kind of breaks through, right? But, you know, he's very easily manipulated throughout almost the entirety of the movie, up until, like, you know, the last, you know, 20 to 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, and I think, like, the thing about Robert De Niro's performance as King Hale, one, he does, like, such a convincing caricature of, like, a Southern robber baron political boss type. that like it almost makes you wonder like why we don't have like a New York Machine movie. I think that'd be great. Like a Boss Tweed like series would
Oh
probably
yeah, yeah.
that'd be pretty tight, right? But his interaction with the Osage is actually pretty unique, right? Like he speaks their language, he understands their culture, he's very comfortable around them. But he also like is observing them all the time, right? Like there was the other white guy who married an Osage woman, and he got the sense that something was up, and he starts praying for her. So it gives you this sense that like, well, he's concerned for everybody deeply, right? And even like at the start of the movie, he instructs Ernest like, here's a book, start reading about their culture, and is also like, you may have the perception that you should keep speaking. No, stay quiet, But I think like there's also this manipulation and instruction going on, right? Where from the jump, he's basically trying to put the idea in Ernest's head of like, well, would you be interested in having a relationship with a Native woman? Would you be interested in making a lot of money? And of course, you have that hilarious scene where he's like, playing blackjack. I love money, but
Yeah.
there is this like clear vibe of like this, desperate cash-strapped nephew coming to his uncle, hat in hand, and his uncle being like, "Oh well, you like women? Yes, sir. I do love women."
Yeah.
you had that whole vibe going on.
Speaking of which, this is a more stylistic thing. Was it just me, or De Niro's accent like just like vanish throughout the movie?
Which one? His like
the southern, like the that like the one that you were doing, like the sort of not quite a plantation owner, but that kind of.
I think because the Oklahoma accent is different from like the usual southern accent, so there is that aspect to it. But I think like.
I thought, like, to me, it seemed like eventually it was just like, this is just Robert De Niro at a certain point.
Probably, like, in, like, the very stern scenes, he probably was just speaking plainly, but he wasn't, full on, like, hey, I'm William Hale King over here. Like, he wasn't doing that shit, but there was definitely points where, like, the accent was more put upon, and I kind of wonder, like, does he do, like, the, like, glad-handing, backslapping, like, white guy voice? I'm not talking about Robert De Niro, but William Hale. Was he trying to be like this amicable, jolly guy to certain people, and then a more neutral and conniving guy in like private settings?
That's fair, yeah.
So there is that aspect to it. But I think like, as their relationship progresses through the film, it's one of like, God damn it, boy, you had one job. Like that's basically his entire like approach to Ernest in the whole film.
Yeah.
And then there's like this one scene at like the end, actually throughout the movie, but it's especially heinous towards the end where like as all the murders occur, Hale like puts on this very convincing performance of like mourning and death, but it's also like this kind of like wasp evangelical fake like piety kind of thing, where he's just like, oh, they've gone back to the Lord kind of thing, and it feels very sick to your stomach when you hear it.
And there's a lot of that stuff that really like tips like the hat early on, like assuming you weren't spoiled by like reading the book or knowing like the actual history of like this like particular case and whatnot. Which I didn't know anything, but like there's some stuff early on where it's just like it comes across like, okay, this guy's completely disingenuous, right? Where there's like the scene where I think it was after Anna's murder, where he's like, "Oh, I'll personally fund the reward for," and that immediately I was like, "Okay, this guy's 100% behind it." And there had already been like a couple little teases at that point about who might be responsible for these, but that like 100%, I was like, "Okay, yeah, he's the kingpin behind this."
100%. So,
especially when he's like, "Oh, make sure you tell me whatever information you get," and it's like, okay, yeah, like this guy is trying to control things. Like, this is 100% super obvious at that point.
Exactly, like classic fake ally stuff.
Yeah,
but I think like the end where like one of Ernest's kids has actually died. I forget of like was it whooping cough? Yeah, he dies of whooping cough.
Yeah.
And then like he's like heartbroken, crying in his cell, and then you have King Hale in the cell over just like doing the false piety thing of like, oh, you know, like God, one of your children has returned to you, and it's like it's brilliant villainy, you know, to like it's brilliant villainy to see acted out on stage, but at the same time, it's like, oh God, this guy sucks. This guy's fake as hell.
Yeah.
So on a similar note too, Ernest and Molly's relationship, is it tainted by his relationship to his uncle, and more broadly, how do we even begin to characterize this kind of abuse and exploitation?
Yeah, this one was weird, right? And it's like it's one of those things that like the little epilogue for this movie, I felt kind of cheated a little bit with, right? Where it was just sort of like, oh yeah, she divorced him after this. And it was like, yeah, that's like the natural conclusion after, you know, your husband has been like poisoning you, right? That you probably are going to ditch him. Which I mean, obviously, yeah, like, I mean, very clearly it's tainted by his uncle's relationship, right? I mean, there's that truth, right? That it wasn't necessarily set up by his uncle. Like maybe he did like truly like have, you know, some type of twisted love for her, but clearly was, you know, willing. I don't think he was stupid enough to just think like, oh, this is purely just slowing her down. Maybe he like believed that like, well, like, you know, diabetes is bad enough to kill her anyways or whatever. But you know, you don't really see like the disintegration of their relationship ever. We're just sort of told about it, and I thought that was kind of a shame. But I mean, obviously at that point the movie had run for, you know, almost 4 hours at that point, so I kind of understand why, but you know, fair enough.
Yeah, it's kind of like the will they won't they of most like romances in films is kind of played out more perversely here, of like, will he ever, you know, admit the truth to her? Will she figure it out, kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think to me, right, it's like, especially in those times, you know, especially in like a conservative approach and definition of the family, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have the patriarch basically controlling his son's actions. You know, your sons are who inherit your property and like help you maintain it. And also, you know, to, you know, maintain your wealth, you will order them to do whatever it takes. You know, daughters are there to, you know, further your line, and any women who marry into the family are the same. And especially if you take his like, you know, cattleman approach to it, he sees everybody as livestock to be, you know, expended at some points.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, whatever like sincerity might have been in Ernest's like affection for Molly is, I would argue, immediately tainted by his uncle pulling the strings.
Yeah, and the fact that like he's completely, I mean, in some cases he is directly responsible for like the death of some of her family members.
Yeah.
And I read this when I was reading some of the actual events. Like her mom, the movie made it seem like she just died because she was old and sick already, but apparently she was also poisoned.
Possibly, yeah.
And like to the point where like she, like Ernest was in part convicted for her murders as well. So like she was part of that trial, was like, you know, that whole family was killed. But like the movie, in my opinion, did not make it. It made it seem like it was just the sisters that had been killed, not the mother. But you know, it's like when it's like you've like, how much can you really say that you love someone if you've like slaughtered their family?
Oh no, and it's especially like you know, it hurts to watch as the audience, because it's like she sincerely did love him, actually, and like she put up with so
that's what
much.
It feels like.
Yeah, like, and it wasn't until like the bitterest end that she's like, okay, fuck this guy, I'm out.
Yeah. And it's a shame that we never get to see like just what was that, like what was like just like the fuck it moment, like what did that look like? But
and I wonder if that was even documented, you know, like what,
yeah,
how much was there to go off of, because when you adapt something to film,
sure,
you have to reimagine it, right? So I wonder, like, I personally like the twist at the end. We will get into this, but I wonder like if the twist was necessary because that's where the narrative ends, and you have to figure out how you're going to adapt this.
Yeah, that could be.
So this actually leads us naturally into the next one. I think we can get into this. So, the Osage versus white people. How are their scenes handled through the film? Do perspectives change based on who's centered? Also, how do we characterize the film's treatment of race, colonialism, etc. thereof?
That's pretty loaded.
It is kind of loaded. I'm like, all right, you better answer this one.
Yeah, I mean, and here's where I think in some ways the film does a good job of it. I mean, I'll be honest, I assume your movie opened the same way with the Martin Scorcese coming out at the start of it about how he worked with, members of the Osage Nation on this and stuff like that.
Yep.
Yeah, which kind of struck me as a little masturbatory, to be honest, but whatever.
I just so you know, I'm like the North Korean news lady about Martin Scorsese. Like, I was okay with it, but I
fair
understand.
enough. Yeah, it was just kind of like, it gave me the vibe where it was like, trust me, guys, I got the N-word pass or something. Like, that was kind of the vibe I got. But and I think like there's some things where I think, and this is like goes to like a larger issue, and like I mean it's really only like an issue when it comes to like the race component of it, but like the way Ernest is portrayed throughout the movie, I think, and maybe some of it is the casting. Like Leonardo DiCaprio is a really well beloved actor and whatnot, and it's like I feel like for someone that's really as scummy as he is, like the character, he comes across, he's like he tries his hardest to make him seem as sympathetic as possible. Both from the way the movie is written and the way like where it just feels like, oh well, like he's unwittingly brought into bringing harm onto his family, and his wife's family and all that stuff, where it's he's just along for the ride. But like obviously the way in general from like a macro level, the way the race issue's handled, right? I mean you see like the exploitation, we talked about this before, where just like kind of profiteering off of the Osage money and stuff like that. They're obviously sort of these targets for basically a money bag. And part of the head rights issue too that we didn't necessarily mention so far is there was going to be a change to the law regarding them, and there ultimately is as a result of all these murders. So there was a rush to kind of get those head rights as soon as possible because I think they were going to be like forfeited back to like the nation as a whole. So there was kind of a rush, like, oh, we need to really kill these people quickly to get their head rights. There's was it Blackie later in the movie where it's like revealed that like he like, or was it someone else who had like the wife, and he's like, oh well, like if I adopt her kids and they happen to die, do I inherit their head rights and stuff like that too? So
no, it wasn't Blackie, but I know who you're talking about.
I couldn't remember if it was him or someone else, like because it was that part of the movie. It started kind of like that was like a weird like just sequence of exposition dumps near the end, I thought, where it was just like, okay, this is like the story for like all of these people and how they're involved with this stuff. The change to the law later for the head rights thing, just to kind of clarify, is that kind of to stop these murders, like because several of them were not solved. Only the ones that we actually see in this movie were solved. They passed a law that basically made it so like non-Osage people couldn't actually inherit these rights. So like the ones that had already been inherited by non-Osage folks, those were fine, but the rest of them couldn't be. So you weren't necessarily incentivized to marry off to some fine Indian woman to then slaughter her in her sleep, or whatever. But you get the sense, right, and where it's like, and like you were talking about with King Hale as well, there's this performative desire to placate these people. The Osage come across as very passive in a lot of ways. Like they are trying to be proactive in stopping like these murders and stuff like that. But you get a reference during their speech, right? Like we're no longer warriors. Back in our old ways, we would have slaughtered the people who are doing this to us. But we have kind of have joined society on like the white man's terms, as it were, and you can see that those terms are, maybe not the worst financially, but definitely not great in terms of the social and societal constructs about them.
I definitely I can see where you're coming from there, and I agree with a lot of that. Something that this is bringing to mind is I think there was that interview of like one of the Osage like advisors who worked on the film, and like his initial like reaction to the film, right? And he talks about in his read, like the film is about like how long will you be complicit in racism, and I think that's like a good way to understand the moral quandary facing Ernest, right? And like you mentioned before, it's like he is presented as somewhat sympathetic. I would say, how much of that is intentionally and how much of that is because he's a protagonist of the film, I don't know. But the one thing that you were mentioning in like how he's presented as sympathetic, I think it goes back to that like family dynamics angle, right? I think if, for those of us who've grown up in strict families or had conservative families, or we've seen things play out in these dynamics, right? He has to answer to William Hale.
Yeah.
And it's the whole like, well, I was ordered to do it quandary, right?
Well,
it's not. Oh, go ahead.
It's interesting. I was going to say, sorry to interrupt, but like when you were talking about the interview point, I hadn't seen that interview, but it's an interesting one to consider with, because I feel like in some ways, like granted, he's a lot more active and, carrying out racism and stuff like that than like the average person. But like, I kind of wonder if it's like, if maybe that's part of the point of him being sympathetic too, is that he feels like what we kind of think of like when we, like to quote, Martin Luther King, right? The white moderate. Yeah. And I mean, granted, like calling him a moderate when he is literally killing people feels, it feels like a stretch, but he definitely feels like he is portrayed that way as much as possible. And I think that might be, maybe that's an angle I wasn't really considering, that's something that like is deliberate to make you think like, oh yeah, like if this like, look at what this person is, willing to do and abide, despite being, supposedly a decent human being.
Right. Like he's not a self-directed person, like he kind of just stumbles into town looking for his next thing to do. You don't get a sense of, why did he serve? He probably has no idea why he served to begin with.
They never touch on that.
They never touch on that. And like, I just get the sense that like, he's always been the kind of guy who's just like stumbling from place to place, which is the most layman thing any of us can do. Right. But, as soon as his uncle puts him in the conspiracy, he's following every single order. And I think, that's the common refrain in like the Nuremberg trials, right? I was just following orders.
Yeah.
How many people earnestly believe that? How many people, see, and how many people like, cynically say that? I don't know. But what I will, if you take the film's thesis to heart, or if you take like our modern approach to things, right? You'd argue like, no, there always is a choice and the choice is fight back. But I guess that's the question is like, do you hold Ernest accountable for not acting because he felt like he was under his uncle's pressure? Or do you hold him accountable because, quote, I love money? And that's your read of that motive will paint how you view Ernest. And I think it's a little bit of both. I think he sincerely wanted the money and was willing to do whatever it takes to get rich. But his conscience,
it's not like he was, just like accidentally benefiting from
these
circumstances.
No, again, this guy was a criminal. Let's get it. Without a doubt. And I also think that, he was very willing to just bow to his uncle on anything and everything. Even when it felt like he was resisting, it felt more like he was stressed out by doing it rather than his conscience. But then there are like moments where like you can tell like he has a genuine affection for his wife, and he doesn't know like like the morally upright person in this case would be like, you know what? let's stop racism, but that's not him. That's not him.
I mean, it's not even so much like let's stop racism. Let's just like, I mean, like I don't necessarily like. I mean, like yeah, there's like obviously some like racist intents here and stuff like that, but I don't think they necessarily. I mean, if they had a way to like get white people's money, I think they would have done it too, right? Like not to like be like, oh well, they're like
they were all hustling each other.
Race neutral.
They were all hustling each other. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they were doing that as well, but the real implications I think come from like there's a few references to it where it's like killing. I can't remember who says it, but there's someone who says some line about like killing an Osage person, like you'd be more likely to be convicted of like killing a dog or something like that, or some other type of animal. But the idea is like that there's like this systemic racism that's not super discussed in this, but discussed enough that I think it's interesting that is one of the main themes of the movie.
For sure. And then like when it comes to the Osage like perspective in the film, this is another thing because I think for the perspective change I was mentioning, right? When like Molly is in the focus of certain scenes, like you can tell there's like a tonal shift in the film. There is like this, like genres change as you were calling it, right? I didn't necessarily find it jarring, but I think like that that difference was necessary to kind of communicate.
It wasn't. To be clear, I didn't necessarily think like her stuff was like the jarring bit. It was more so kind of like the way things changed later, like with some of the more court drama focused things and stuff like that.
Yeah, it definitely turned into like Scorsese's classic crime bits, right? Where it's like the gang gets rounded up by the cops. There's the big court trial. Like it definitely turned into classic Scorsese towards the end a bit. I agree. But I think like the tonal shifts at the start of the movie, I felt like they were good because it sets up just how different the two of them are. But also like I appreciate the subtlety in the background of how the Osage Nation has been changed by American money. And it kind of, there's this subtext that's going on in the film. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but basically, like, it's kind of why, like, that first scene where they mourn the death of their culture, now that the kids are learning English, they're kind of transformed into, like, I wouldn't say, like, I mean, we would call them American aristocracy, but I would basically argue that, like, no, they're the regular bourgeois now. And a lot like how the Osage become tremendously wealthy with the discovery of oil money, you had a similar process going on in Tulsa as well, with the black population there in Black Wall Street. So I kind of like had this, at least in my estimation, right? I'm not white, but I'm also neither of these backgrounds. I had this like anecdotal read, in my opinion, of like to make it rich in America or to strike success is this kind of like assimilation into whiteness, right? I don't think that you can inherently separate that reality from success or wealth in America. That's at least my read of events. And I think the oddity that white people might have had when encountering Tulsans or encountering people from Osage country, I wonder to what extent it was like, these people are rich, but also they're enjoying all the things rich white people enjoy. I don't know if that's like, it was an intentional subtext or if that's subtext that I caught and I'm putting my own opinions on. I'll admit that up front. But
I mean, I definitely think the Tulsa comparison is, I think that's super, super subtext if it is like subtext, because I don't necessarily know that was like, because that requires a lot more background.
It's not brought up in the movie. It's not brought up in the movie at all, right? That's just like stuff I'm putting my own spin on. But like like you said, where they have that, all the elders meet and they're like, we got to do something about these murders. We're not warriors anymore. It's kind of them like, this is a society that's not only adapting to moving out of their traditional mode of living and now adopting, the at the time modern American state with its own legal obfuscations,
Yeah.
bourgeois norms, money and lawyers versus, going up to fight people, right? And trying to navigate, the system within. So it's like, when people of color try to play the system to their advantage, how is that going to play out for them? And I think we see in the film, right, that, the criminal element will resist that with both judicial and extrajudicial means. And we'll probably get into that a bit later.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say, though, they're not necessarily leveraging the system to their advantage. They're just trying to get it to work the way it's intended to.
Exactly.
Right? They're trying to get it to work in a more egalitarian fashion. And, like, they eventually sort of, I mean, I kind of get maybe that pro-cop sentiment from the source material in the sense that, like, in addition to, like, what I said about the FBI, that, like, any of their forms of legal recourse before that were, like, intentionally obfuscated, right? Like, it was, like, the private investigator is killed. Like, all the things that, like, all the avenues they were pursuing, they weren't able to leverage them, not because, like, the system was, like, inherently racist against them, but because, like, there was a criminal element explicitly blocking that intervention.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, it is this, like, American phenomenon, right? Of, like, we all think the system's going to work for us, and then when we first discover it doesn't, oftentimes in dizzying and in horrifying ways, we find out just how the system won't work for us. I also think there's the one scene where, like, after Ernest and Molly get married, the house is full of white people all of a sudden. Was like that was an interesting scene. That was an interesting scene.
And it's weird too, because, like, there was, like, that old white couple that's, like, super, super fucking racist. Yeah. And I had no idea who they were. I'm like, did these people show up earlier and I just forgot them, and they don't show up again? And, like, there's a lot of, like, just background people in this movie that, like, I don't know if they're there to just, like, provide commentary. I get the impression that that's all they're there for. Was just to, like, hey, like, here's, some old white folks here to talk about demon spawn. Like that, it felt like that was, like, their entire purpose.
I think like, again, like, the interesting part of that scene, right, is it kind of shows, like, how they feel displaced immediately in their own homes with these newcomers.
Yeah, I think there's that macro narrative there too, like that. There's, like, and I think, it's interesting because, like, the way we normally think of, like, how, like, white folk had, like, overtaken, native cultures and whatnot, we primarily think of violence, disease, guns, germs, and steels. That's the kind of stuff that we think of. Right. Whereas here you get this much more. Obviously there's the criminal element of it too, but this more, like, legal and, like, sort of civil effort to do it, right? Like, and frankly, like, if they were more patient and, maybe, they were motivated by, like, the law and whatnot, expiring to sort of become more aggressive with it. If they were more patient, right, you would just get the sense that, like, oh yes, like, the white culture would just sort of, subsume this native culture, right? Like, it's, you've already seen where, like, the religion has been injected into it. They're all worshipers of, Christ the Lord, and, they're Christians. They go to church and all that stuff. You see, like, the white people in their homes. You see all this stuff where it's in not in a way that they're, like, particularly resistant of, right? It's just like, yeah, like, this is just the facts of life and whatnot. And I kind of wonder if that is, like, one of the things that, like, like, I think it's a good message from this movie that, like, and not good in the sense that it, like, is a good thing that happened or anything like that. But
more like it was good they explored it.
Yeah, because it's something that is really underexplored, I think, in our popular understanding of the way, Native Americans have been subjugated here historically.
yeah, having it boiled down to like the family level it is an interesting perspective to it all, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think like that also speaks to like a uniqueness of like the American colonial style, right? Which is like I think I've talked to people like obliquely about some of this stuff, and some of this is like anecdotal, but European style racism is very cut and dry, us versus them style shit.
Yeah.
Whereas like in the US, like America like is very close to like having like plurinational identity in a lot of places, especially like the South, if you think about it. But the racial hierarchy acts more like a caste system in effect, than like a traditional us versus them bigotry, So you have like, like intermarriage is very common in the American context. You have people working and living in like the same regions a lot of the times, like whether it's in the past or in the present. But I think like, the racial caste system plays out in the, in instances of mass violence, but also in, how the legal system and how systemic elements are carried out on people on a, case to case basis, right?
Yeah.
So that's just like a uniqueness of like the American colonial experience, right? Is that people have always kind of been more prone to like be up next to one another, even though they're different. And I think that's why like the American conservative or the American reactionary element is so frightened of interracial relationship or interracial marriage, because it immediately contradicts, the classic style of racism.
Yeah, 100%. And like that's kind of the point, right? Is it's kind of, all of your justifications for racism are inherently undermined by, mixed race stuff, like, right? The idea you can't, it's hard to write it off as like, like they're subhuman when it's like, well, they're compatible with what you view as humans. And the more the races and the blood mixes, then like you sort of turn everything into sort of this subhuman level in their minds, right? So it kind of runs like, it's a direct threat to the core tenets of those beliefs.
Yeah, and I think that's like the most like unique aspect of American styles of racism, right? Is that you can hold the most hostile and like bigoted views about people you are in direct proximity with, rather than a neat distance away from you. So there is that. On a less depressing note, what did you think of like some of the magical realism elements in like the Osage focus scenes, like the owl when the mother was dying, or when she crosses into the next world, she's greeted by her ancestors? What did you think of that?
I liked it. Like it was something that, like, again, I'm a little ignorant about a lot of the symbolism of a lot of like native cultures and stuff like that. I'm sure he worked closely with people in the Osage Nation to like appropriately address these things and whatnot. I mean, I was aware of like the relevance of owls and stuff like that, but I thought it was a good visual to show that, right? And they explained it, right? It wasn't like it was something that like, oh hey, like, yeah, hope you did your homework on what this fucking owl means. It's like it was like, like, oh, okay, like, the owl is sort of like this kind of ill omen about how our, sort of the death of our blood and stuff like that. Which ironically, I mean, parallel for the conversation we just had, it's sort of like the inverse version of it, right? It's like there is that kind of racism with that. I mean, I don't necessarily know if they necessarily view white people as subhumans and whatnot, but they definitely don't seem to, at least the mother didn't seem fond of the intermingling.
Yeah, it definitely the subtext with those scenes kind of felt more like, we're on the short end of the stick of this interaction, and they seem to have, gotten the upper hand from this.
And it's like, I think from like the macro narrative sense, like you get like not only that sense of like the short end of the stick, but like the idea that like they're facing like extinction. Like these half Osage children are kind of props for, for profit, really.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's kind of, there's something to that, right? And like you don't like you don't really explore like the children's lives much, right? I mean, there's a scene ironically very similar to the one in Oppenheimer where they like send off the child because they can't take care of it. I mean, they still had the other two, I guess, but the one that inevitably dies from whooping cough or whatever respiratory illness it was.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, it wasn't like she was like a character in the movie. She was just, there as like, oh hey, like, a child's dead, isn't that sad? And maybe it's, like, if you sort of buy into more like biblical or spiritual elements, like maybe that's sort of a representation of their crimes and stuff like that. And I think there might have been an indirect thing, right? Because like, I mean, Molly was already being like kind of poisoned at that point, right? I think it was implied that the insulin she was always getting was, impure or like designed to like slowly kill her. And like, King Hale's like kind of, like, hey, why would you get her pregnant right now? Like, you idiot. So like, I think, there's that sense of like sin there as well. But again, it's sort of just like this prop of like, this is the like human cost of your actions. Not that like, this is like a fleshed out character with their own motivations.
Yeah. Very, very Catholic, aesthetic choice there from Scorsese.
Yeah.
Yeah. Next up, the use of photography and the newsreel. What do you make of the use of those scenes, and what do you think is implied there?
Yeah, that was a good question. I'm trying to think. Well, I can't remember what the first one was. There was like two scenes with it, right? There was the one where the Tulsa massacre and whatnot. And then I know you have a theory for it. I didn't necessarily think that much of it, other than like it does come up a couple times that like as like sort of a kind of showing like the general pattern of like racial resentment and stuff like that in the era. Do you remember what the other time it was used?
I think it was like initially like to talk about like the Tulsa oil money. That was definitely one of the times it was brought up.
Okay.
And then also like just the additional scenes of like all the people who got their picture taken.
Yeah. I think I mean, I don't know. I've seen that like so much in a lot of like historical things from like this era. I didn't think that much of it stylistically. It just seemed like kind of like one of those like genre staples. Or period piece staples from that time, in my opinion. But like, I think it's kind of showing the. I just kind of got a sense of like this is just showing like what's going on. I know you had your theory that you want. I'll let you talk about that for like the Tulsa reel specifically though.
Yeah, so I mean, like I was mentioning earlier, the scene of the girl peering into the tent as the elders are mourning. So there is this like subtle theme of like observing and being observed. Who's watching you? And then I think you can kind of parrot it into like, information as a tool of, control. Knowing things about other people to like, target them. I don't necessarily know if like Scorsese had like that as an explicit idea when coming up with the film, but these are just like the ideas I'm getting from like how I perceive the film, right? Which opens up a new meta narrative. But I think it's like, again, like all these white photographers taking pictures of the Osage. It kind of starts setting this like, idea in the film of not only is the other able to observe you, they can pass that information along. And I think that's the difference between like the oral tradition of passing on information versus like, now you have a picture. Now you can see something clear as day. Now you can pass that information on. And then the newsreel as a way to like, at least for the time, get expedited news about what's going on in the world. It presents like this kind of development, right?
It is, at that time, doing like some key.
Yes. Of course. And then I definitely saw like a lot of reads in this similar vein when after the movie came out of, photography being used as a thematic device to explore this idea of who tells your story, who's looking at you, who's representing you. Right. And then in the scene where Hale's in the movie theater and he's looking at the film reel about the Tulsa bombings. This isn't necessarily my idea, but I saw this theory on Twitter, and I think it makes sense. Where basically, he sees the bombings, and then not too long after that, they start initiating a plan to bomb the other white guy's house to get the head rights, right?
Yeah.
And that also just like really heightens the tensions and really like exacerbates the murders, right? Like I think like that period is still known as like the Reign of Terror, right? So like that was probably like a major exacerbatory event in that Reign of Terror, and like you had like people as soon as the bomb goes off, you have people like screaming in the streets like it's just like Tulsa all over again.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
I think like film and photography as a means of conveying information and the phenomenon of being able to observe people and make meaning of observation. It's a theme that I think is getting explored in the film. I just don't know how deeply it was intended to be explored in the film.
Sure, yeah, I buy that.
That takes us to our next one, and this is the one that I really started cooking up some theories for. So, the Masonic paddling scene. What was your reaction to that?
I was a bit surprised by it. Like, and I was like the Masonic stuff. I was like, okay, like, so of course there's a Freemason conspiracy in here. And then, of course, you get like the paddling itself. I mean, it seemed like a bit of like mostly just like I think there for levity and whatnot, right? It reinforces that hierarchy between King
like the family
and
dynamic,
Ernest.
yeah,
like and that was it seemed like that was the primary purpose here, and probably like doing it with a bit more levity, right? Like seeing like an actual like paddle being used on a grown man, right? That's always going to be like kind of funny. So yeah, that was kind of my read on it.
Yeah, it definitely had me like just raise an eyebrow a bit, but I think like people overstate masonry as like devil worship kind of stuff. You don't really need to go that far. You don't have to, because it's like, again, the film already points out that like all the white businessmen are in on the conspiracy, right? Yeah. King Hale is like, this well-connected political boss. He knows all the judges. He knows all the lawyers. He knows all the businessmen in town. He's well-connected.
The doctors, like
the doctor. It's so all the bourgeois guys who would back in the day be Masons.
Well, there's a few people he doesn't seem as or he's like taking advantage of, because there is he is taking advantage of insurance fraud and stuff like that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah,
because they do mention like later on where there's like the guy, like I'm assuming in business, or where he's like had signed off like, oh, like fire insurance, and then he like literally burns his farm the next day. And then of course there's like the other guy who he had insurance money on, I believe if it was only if he didn't kill himself, which is why I was confused when they were like, he's supposed to look like he killed himself. But there's the life insurance and all that stuff. So like there's a little bit of an adversarial relationship with some of the bourgeois interest.
Yeah, for sure. Like there's always the competing bourgeois interests. Yeah. Like different classes different professional classes will compete with another.
Yeah.
But at least like in his time, right? Like oil man, cattle man, like that was the traditional rich guy role, so yeah. That's not too shocking. Him getting paddled, like I think was just like him reasserting that's like You're a petulant child. Do as I command. The one thing that did tie into the book that I think, like, it shouldn't be understated, like the Masonic link, because when he turned himself in, he was wearing a perfectly pressed suit, shoes shined to a gleam, a felt hat, and an overcoat with his diamond-studded Masonic lodge pin fastened to the lapel. So it's like, I'm sure he was definitely trying to signal to the judge, a lawyer, somebody, like, guys, come on. You've seen me in the back rooms. Come on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's your guy. We pay dues. Come on. And it's the kind of thing, right, where it's like, when you look at like crimes of the elite today, they just do it in the open these days. Whereas like back in the day, they had things like Masonic lodges. And I think there's even like a scene too where it's like, the Masonic connection is actually pretty mundane if you think about it. Like in the same building where the doctor's office is, there's like a scene of like Hale talking to, I think, like Molly's like first husband, and like when the camera pans back to him, there's like a painted wall saying Masonic Lodge to your left.
Oh, okay.
So it's like it's not, they're not trying to like make some kind of like deep wink. Like I think they're actually trying to point that like, no, the Masonic link is actually more mundane. Like all the rich guys in town were probably Masons. Hell, you even had like that one like blink and you miss it scene of like the sheriff was also like the grand wizard of the local clan.
Oh yeah. I remember there was the that very brief KKK came. I forgot who was under the hood, as it were.
It was that turkey neck motherfucker. Yeah, that's all I remember.
Yeah.
But the one like blink and you miss it line that I think like ties everything together, shows that how well researched the film is, in my opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
William King Hale was a segregationist. That is a known fact about him. It's mentioned in the book.
Oh.
He was a member of the Democratic Party. He was I wouldn't know if he was like the boss of the Oklahoma machine, but like definitely a Democratic machine.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and then he mentions like in that scene where he's paddling Ernest, I am a 32nd degree Mason. Like what, don't get wrapped up into the occult perception of Masonry. What I really think like that indicates, right, is that he's part of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. What that leads you to is like, this is the Rite of Freemasonry all the Confederates were in. These are the clubs these guys were hanging out in,
I didn't know that. Okay.
So it's like, you don't need to do like something as esoteric as Freemasonry. Like, rich people will gather in all sorts of groups like the Rotary Club. Now you have, PAX, you have ALEC, you have the Heritage Foundation.
Sure.
You can do some of this stuff in the open now. You don't have to do it in secret. But, at the time, like rich guys who were getting up to no good, I argue they were using Freemasonry to enable it. And these were the social groups where rich white men would, collaborate and, figure out how they could, invent new and creative ways to exploit, exploit the people in the Osage country.
Yeah, for sure.
And considering that it was like, a criminal enterprise, I mean, that's like, how different is that from like a traditional, mob film where like they all meet in the back of a restaurant or something.
Right. Yeah.
So then let's get into this. This probably ties us to like the latter part of the film. So petitions to the federal government not being taken seriously and the arrival of the proto FBI and their investigation. How does the unraveling of the conspiracy play out?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess like initially it's not that so much that the petitions aren't taken seriously, it's that the petitioners are like removed from the picture before they're able to like do their job, right?
Right.
Like they do show that like the person that they had sent there to Washington is killed pretty quickly. Presumably before he gets to do anything. But then the FBI comes. Or I guess it's just the Bureau at that point. What is the
Bureau of Investigation.
Yeah, I can't remember if it's because I remember reading like conflicting reports if it was like now the FBI here, or if it was the Bureau of Investigation or what. Because I read something or two that this was one of the first, if not the first, like murder investigation by the FBI. But I don't know how accurate that necessarily is. But it's it's one of those things where you kind of get the sense that like it's it sort of portrays the conspiracy as sort of like this house of cards, right? That sort of comes crumbling down the minute like the FBI shows up, right? It becomes like really obvious. Like once you have like these professionals who are not like in on everything, who are not, incentivized to, abide and even participate in these machinations, they're able to relatively quickly turn things around, right? I mean, other than the fact that they're sort of putting up with some, kind of weird antics from like Ernest and other folks who are, trying to deny things, but like they have things figured out pretty quickly, I think. And at that point, right, as the audience, like we already kind of have everything figured out too at that point, right? There's no real mysteries there.
And just to interrupt you real quick, I'm sorry. Like that isn't, necessarily like the pro cop take that it needs to be, right? Because when you look at like the era of the robber barons, it took federal intervention to actually solve that issue. And like, I did say like the nanny state tongue in cheek earlier, but like this is the case for, federal intervention, and specifically like for a strong state, where when things like this are just, when shit is really hitting the fan, you can call it, you can call the cavalry in and create order,
Well, and that's like kind of the drawback when you're like bringing in sort of your like modern sensibilities about different things.
Of course.
To like older eras, right? Not to like kind of, like I know that argument's used a lot to like sort of defend like, well, who cares if the founding fathers had slaves or whatever, like, men of their time, all that shit. But like, there is like sort of like when you're just like kind of like when you make these more blanket statements, like, like if you like, wear on your sleeve ACAB, and you kind of like hold that as like this, that has always been the case and whatnot. It does like, that's not a nuanced take. And normally people like, sort of acknowledge the nuances with it when they say it. They just don't want to, say, some cops are bastards. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue as well. Yeah. And specifically specify which cops are bastards, and then you really start getting a impressive acronym. But I think that like when you do sort of make that sort of ossification, you sort of miss out that like we have law enforcement for a reason, right? And like whether or not you prefer a strong central government and stuff like that, it was essential in certain eras to prevent certain things, right? Like that it's only with the FBI's intervention that this stuff is unraveled, and it unravels pretty quickly, at least as it's portrayed in the movie, right? I mean, obviously, in real life there were I think up to like 60 murders, and like the movie only sort of alludes to it, like there being murders outside of it, right, where they sort of have the people like putting on the lights and stuff like that, where they're like, oh, they want to stop the murders. Like there was a lot more going on than just what we see in the movie, and
right.
The FBI doesn't actually solve all of that, but for the narrative purpose, you do get the sense that it's maybe a little bit more pro cop, as you might sort of simplify it as, than maybe even the reality in this particular case.
Yeah, and I think like the scene where it gets revealed who all was part of the Bureau of Investigation, right? Like you had the native guy in deep cover. That dude was swagged out. He was looking cool in that movie.
Yeah, it was so like it was like one of those things. Like the movie did a lot where it sort of introduced characters and concepts that like it like sort of explained later. But like I just remember like when he was introduced, it's like, okay, like this is somebody, right?
Yeah,
and,
like he's gonna come back later. Well, I'm pretty sure, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like you had him in deep cover, then you had like the fake insurance agent, and then you have Jesse Plemons show up. It's like, I'm here with the Bureau of Investigation from Mr. J. Edgar Hoover.
Mm-hmm.
Who's asking? Me, sir. Like that scene was like, oh, he's in trouble now. And then you have them all on like the other side of the Hale property when Hale's trying to burn it down for the insurance money.
Yeah.
And like it kind of just like sets them up as like this. I guess you didn't need to like have them develop that way, but it kind of sets them up as like the rivals to like the Hale gang, if you can view them that way.
And sort of like, for the purpose of this narrative, sort of like omniscient too.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Where it's like they know everything. Like it's all figured out.
Yeah, and then like because they have it all figured out, like the next scene is like, you know, as they're burning the Hale property, like you get like that another magical realism scene, but it's kind of like as the property is burning, you get this like hellfire imagery, and again this more Catholic imagery from Scorsese here of like this inferno of the Hale machine on its like last knee.
Yeah.
And then you have it like jump into the courts scenes too. This is where you know, Brendan Fraser comes in as Ernest. What did you think of his performance? Like I think people are kind of overreacting to it, but what did you think?
It was definitely over the top, but in a like I thought like for an entertainment purpose at least in the best way. Like just his like kind of and you kind of get the sense that like, you know, like obviously the legal system has been around for forever, right? The court system's been around for a really long time, but you get the sense that like things don't feel fully figured out in that, right? Where like his objection is like so like kind of like ridiculous, but it works because
right.
like, you know, like there's just like things haven't been like quite as ironed out yet, I guess. And like maybe, you know, it's some of it, like the role is the fact that you have, you know, as we've mentioned, you know, sort of this legal inequality between Osage and whites.
Right. And I think like you also have like the interspersed scenes of like all the different gang members getting arrested, interrogating. You had like I think the one obvious criminal, Blackie was his name, basically like, shit, I'll snitch if you give me like, you know, a year off or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have them all picked up. Then you have the guy who was like, well, can I kill my kids and collect the head rights? And then his lawyer being like, you just told me you're planning to kill your kids. Are you sure about this? Like, like you have them all picked up by like the different BOI members. And you see the case start to develop, and you see like Hale, like, you know, his smug grin start to wipe off his face.
He always still seems to like feel like he's in control.
He does.
Even though like even when you see like everything is like come apart, he still you know, he still has that swagger.
Well, and I think like again, like I think that he's really trying to be like, come on, I'm a well-connected Mason. You guys know me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting off of this, right? But then I think there's also that scene where I'm trying to remember which one was it, where they bring Ernest back to see Molly, but also to like have that stern talking to with all the other people in the Hale machine. Yeah. And you have like, you know, Brendan Fraser and all the other white people like looking at him monolithically. All of them in the frames
too.
Yeah, you have some. Yeah, you had oil barons, right? I think you had like the head of Standard Oil was there by name, right? And
so, yeah,
they're all basically like staring him down, being like, "Do not fuck this up." And you see like, you know, Ernest like, just like, you know, his threadbare spinelessness like really like starting to bite him in the ass, because it's like you're starting to see like, oh, the pressure's on, and he really doesn't want to do this. Yeah. But I don't think he's like, you know, he's not brave enough to be like, nah, fuck this. This is a bridge too far even for me. He's just in like I think if he had the choice, he would just vanish, you know?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
That's the kind of guy he is. But that scene, like, I think it hammers it all together, right? Where it's like, no, like William Hale had a game going. It was to make as much money off the oil as possible. He was going to be an oil baron on par with the rest. He was going to set up this this side, and I think it's like, you know, it's very pertinent that's like it's all the white people in a room asking Ernest, "Hey, you with us or not?"
Right. Yeah.
Because it is like the subtext of like, you know, the invention of whiteness as a social construct. You know, like white as a social identity didn't really exist until like, you have to control people of other races in a hegemonic context, right?
Mhm.
So then you have like blackness invented as a construct, brownness, all this stuff, right? But then like, because otherwise, like, you know, before people would self-identify as like, no, I'm English, no, I'm French. But for all the white people to be like, no, 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 we're white. We got the money. We got the authority here. Ernest, don't fuck it up. Join our team. And then for him to basically understand the stakes, but have no spine to decide what to do next,
Mhm.
I think it's like the most damning indictment of his character, you know?
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
what else? What else about the court and the unraveling of the conspiracy did you think was of note or interesting?
Um, and this is the kind of part where I did feel like the movie went like I don't think we needed all of it, right? Because like they sort of show like um the unraveling of like how like, exactly how certain murders played out, right? Whereas like I don't necessarily know if it was as essential to it. I think that like at that point you're sort of testing maybe the patience of your audience in terms of like whether they'll be like respond to this in like the brutalistic fashion that like they might have had they seen it earlier. um but it was I think it was kind of nice seeing things kind of come together there. Of course you get the sort of confessional at the end from when Ernest does eventually do the right thing, and then he meets with Molly for that last time. And the one thing he's not willing to admit to is the poisoning of her, right? And that's presumably what leads to her divorce of him and whatnot. But that's kind of that it's that further indictment of his character, right? He's really not like, and even then, right? Like the stuff that he is taking accountability for, right? It's stuff that he had taken like plea bargains for and stuff like that. So it's like he's really unwilling to fully accept like responsibility and accountability for a lot.
Mm-hmm. And I know you mentioned earlier too that because I agree with your take on that. When the genre shift happens towards this point, right? Like I kind of feel like there was no way but to have that happen if you wanted to include the Bureau of Investigation plotline. So
Maybe,
like
yeah.
when did the shift happen where you were like, okay, I don't know if I'm feeling this. Like at what point did that kick in for you?
I mean, honestly, it would have been Brendan Fraser stood up and said that might have been where it just felt like I'm like, okay, it feels like I'm watching like an Ace Attorney video or something like that instead. And it wasn't like that. It was like I don't think it made it like bad. It was just like it was like one of these things. I was like, okay, like this feels like we're kind of like this movie has taken me for like a big ride where we've gone through just like a lot of stuff. And I mean, some of that is like, the FBI thing as well. I mean, that kind of like mainly when they're like gathered in the field, it felt like when the perspective is more on them, it felt like, okay, this is definitely like different and maybe a little disjointed from things we were at. So yeah, that was kind of my my take on that.
I also kind of wonder like if that was a stylistic choice because like we mentioned earlier, like the film basically takes place in like what's effectively the Wild West. And then when they come into the courtroom, like it's all stuffy, very stiffly official, almost like mirroring the aesthetic sensibilities of the East Coast. Like I think like the scene in DC where like the color is like more like cold, like it's a cold color tone, and all the scenes in Oklahoma are more like a warm color tone. I wonder if that was intentional.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, definitely like it feels artistic, but I mean, I know it's like kind of like, it's like DC has that more like it seemed more smoggy and whatnot too.
Right.
And that might be for some artistic purpose, maybe more so than like reflecting reality or something like that, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, like there was this like cold color tone in like the courtroom, and I wonder if that was like intentional, like to show that like this is a space that's trying to project itself as like cold and neutral, or if that's just like, I don't know, me ascribing meaning that wasn't there.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Might need to rewatch. Although I don't know if I can sit down for another 4-hour viewing. I'll probably have to take an interval for that one. Oh boy.
Sure. Yeah.
So that takes us to probably the ending, right? So with the proto true crime podcast, where true crime files from J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah.
Which point is Scorsese making here about true crime entertainment, or like how we tell crime stories?
Yeah, I mean, my initial reaction was that I thought this was a weird way to end it, but I think it's a comment. I mean, I don't know how, like, because it's like, is it a commentary on just the fact that we like view these like through the lens of just like pure entertainment, right? But at the same time, it's like they went through with doing it anyway. So like, is it that meta of a commentary, or is it just like sort of just accepting that this is the reality of true crime podcasts and true crime, I guess, in general, right? That it, one man's death is another man's, Tuesday night afternoon. I don't know. But like, that was kind of, is that like, it's, I don't know if it's that meta level or not, but again, it's sort of weird if you sort of go through with it anyways, and are sort of deliberate in it.
Yeah. Like, I think like we were saying earlier, right, is like, the shift to the true crime show is definitely jarring, and I wonder like what the rationale was for it. Was Scorsese, trying to make a dig at true crime entertainment, or was it like, I don't know how we're gonna end this, so let's just get creative with it? Who's to say? But
yeah,
I think,
as I said, it felt like it was maybe a dig, but if you just did it yourself, like, then you're complicit with said like phenomenon.
I think he's like trying to admit he's complicit.
Maybe, yeah.
Like I definitely think that like in how he's talked about the film and how people are reacting to the film, Scorsese's making it very clear that like, no, white people are complicit in this, and then his role in the ending might just be like him winking and saying, "No, I know I'm complicit. I'm admitting it." But I also think that like we were mentioning earlier with like film and photography and this idea of representing other people's stories and relaying events, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at like the way that scene was structured, like I think it really opens with like a red curtain opening, and then you have like a whole like band doing like the music and sound effects. There's like a Foley artist doing the sound effects live. You have like voice acting and stuff. And it's this, it's this performance, artfully done, but still a performance. And it's spectacular and strange all the same, because all of the people retelling this story had nothing to do with what we just saw.
Yeah. Which
I think is like a meta commentary on like this phenomenon of observation we were talking about earlier, right? So I kind of just wonder, like, was the intention there to be like, we need to look at the past, but also when we retell the past, there is like this surreptitious tainting, or like there's just some aspect of retelling that like has a harmful quality that we have to reckon with, or that when it comes to who tells your story and for what intentions they do it, those intentions matter. I don't necessarily know if that was the intention from the jump, like I would need Scorsese himself to confirm that. But I think ending it with that stylistic choice of a true crime podcast, it is kind of him admitting like, yeah, at some level, when we talk about crime, when we talk about horrible things, there is a chance and there is a real possibility that it becomes entertainment in the process. And what does that say about the film? What does that say about what we're doing right here with our discussion of it?
Yeah, I think it's just one of those existential questions, right? I mean, it's kind of evergreen, right? I mean, even like, I think, God, was it the last episode that we did together where it was like, we talked about like, everyone has to have a take.
Right.
And it is kind of like that, component of it, right? It's that sort of taken up to 11 in a lot of ways, right? As it's sort of like, spectator entertainment out of, murder and stuff like that, right? As I said, one man's death is another man's Netflix and chill these days, and that's you know grim, but it's one of those like sort of facts of life that do we change? Do we not? Like, is there still value to that entertainment, right? Like beyond just like the raw entertainment value? Like, does it inform you something that might be valuable and maybe preserving your own life, or does it teach you something valuable, like about the history of different peoples and stuff like that? That's this movie, I think, endeavors to do.
Yeah, and I think like again, as you mentioned, like it almost makes me wonder if that was the intent for having it be a full 4-hour viewing of like, you're going to miss this if you take breaks. Maybe that's the case. I also think it is worth mentioning too that like immediately after this, like it kind of takes us back to reality with like a scene that has nothing to do with the events of the movie. It was like a real like traditional dance they cover with like a overhead drone shot. And it's like, it has that symbolic value of like saying, no, the Osage are still here. They still have preserved their culture and their ways. Mm-hmm. And also that like, it might be like the immediate follow-up to that question of like, take yourself back to reality then after you've learned these things, like,
yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to summarize it.
Possibly. Which I guess, yeah, now we can get into our extended discussion, right? So I think we did talk about this earlier. Scorcese as a director of crime cinema.
And I think that directly ties in. I mean, he literally shows up at the end of his movie, right? I mean, he's there to give the wrap up for, the epilogue with the True Crime podcast.
Yeah. I'm just trying to see like if there's anything else we can jump to in these points in the outline. Let's see. Yeah, are the posses and political bosses of the Wild West no different from the mob and mafiosos of Scorsese's usual focus?
I mean, I think stylistically, no, right? Well, I mean, like, I guess like the superficial sense they're a little different, but they're very, very similar, right? I mean, maybe it helps that he casts De Niro in like every fucking movie he can. So like, yeah, like, I'm sure like he could, what range he portrays like all these like same types of people, right, that are kind of in that territory. But yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of they're not really that different, right? There's if you're someone who like truly believes that the law is the end all be all, then I guess there's a difference. But like, I mean, at the end of the day, it's our laws don't always keep up with our ethics and morality.
Yeah, I definitely think that
are sometimes designed to explicitly enable unethical and immoral behavior.
Citizens United, I'm looking at you. I will say, like, to that point, right? Like, I think Scorsese, pathologically has to get everybody Italian in the movie, no matter what. So of course, having Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio just play like absolute country yahoos it was entertaining.
Sure. Yeah.
I also think like the guy who was saying like, oh, can I kill my kids for the money? That guy was also Italian too. And I was just like, this guy was like a mob hitman in The Irishman. And now you have him playing just another like yahoo. It's like, what range?
Yeah.
We also touched on this earlier, the theme of being complicit. How far does this go? I think I covered that as well as I could. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that we really covered the breadth of that, right? I mean, I think the idea that Ernest is sort of a proxy for sort of the everyman who's complicit, yet he's also like more than complicit in a lot of ways, right? He's a more active participant than like the more passive complicity that I think is really kind of the driving force of a lot of societal issues, right? Because there's more people who are just passive about it.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder, like, maybe it just as a moral question, right? Like, his complicity is unique in that if he resisted at any point, his resistance would have a lot more impact than anyone else's. And I think that's kind of says something about our complicity in a lot of things, like if we consider our complicitness to be mundane in some aspects, would that lead us to be in a position to be morally numb when our resistance wouldn't matter? I don't know, but I think it's worth considering. I think we did touch on this point well enough. American society is a regime of property rights.
Yeah, I think that's something we definitely got to.
Yeah,
sort of a theme of this show in general.
Yeah. I think we did that well enough. Indigenous input, criticism, and perspectives on the film.
I haven't engaged with this that much. I mean, I have Scorsese's word that he consulted with indigenous folks. That's about, and I think that's nice, assuming that he, is honest about that, right? I think that's cool. I think the way the indigenous actors played their characters, I thought they all did a really good job too.
Yeah, I'd say that for sure. Like, a lot of the people who were involved in consulting and advising for the film, like, mentioned that like their input helped the film for the better. And like Lily Gladstone confirmed that herself, which is great. And she was amazing in this film too, right?
Yeah.
And similarly, like the interview I was mentioning earlier, where one of the Osage consultants for the film, like, he shared like his very, very frank thoughts on the film after the first viewing. And he mentioned like, yeah, my feelings are complicated. I think that, Scorsese did a good job and all, but he wished that there was a little more emphasis put on Lily Gladstone's character, that there was a bit more.
That was, I thought, a weakness of it. I mean, I get like for a decent chunk of the film, she's virtually incapacitated the entire time. But I did kind of feel like her perspective was secondary or maybe even tertiary in the movie. And I felt that she was maybe deserved a little bit better than that.
Yeah, which is, I think, like in his estimation, right? Like he was saying, like, the film has obvious limits because it's a Scorsese film, because a white guy and a white lead are, at the heart of this film, right? So that limits the Osage perspective by design, right?
Yeah.
But and that's why, in his estimation, he said that it's a film about that whose thematic question is, how complicit are you willing to be with racism? And I think if that's the read of the film, right, then that is the natural conclusion of having, a white guy at the helm of the film, right?
Yeah.
That's, I think, an angle that he can explore. But I think, like, yeah, if the film was told from an Osage perspective, it would be completely different. And I think, like, before David Grann wrote the book, there was a novel that told a fictionalized version of these events called Mean Spirit, and I think the author was indigenous, so there is that lens to it. But I think for sure that, again, the meta commentary of the film comes back once again, right? Where it's like, who tells your story, who represents you, and how does that color the truth? It comes back once again.
Sure.
I will also say too that there was an actress who had worked with Lily Gladstone. I forget what her name is. But she had posted a thread about her, experience viewing the film. And she was on this FX series, Reservation Dogs, if you've heard of it.
I think I've heard of it. I haven't watched it.
It's really good. I watched all three. I think there were 3 seasons. It's really good. It's really good.
Okay.
But it's a different approach to indigenous film and art, where it's like, instead of it being about the past and about past atrocities, it kind of chronicles 4 kids living in like Muskogee country, and how they are adapting to the death of one of their friends, and she plays like a lead role in that. Let me look this up. I need to be better about this. What's her name? Yeah, Devery Jacobs. She wrote a thread about like her take on the film, right?
Okay.
And Lily Gladstone was also on this series. And she was basically saying how, like, you know, she found it hard to watch because it's, you know, about very disturbing things that happen to the Osage. So I felt like, you know, that's a fair criticism. And I think, like, you know, that's just something that you can't downplay in, you know,
and
these songs of the past.
That's something that's always hard with stuff like this, right? Where it feels like it's, you know, where it's, you know, the discomfort is like, in some ways it's, I mean, again, I'm not, you know, a part of that culture, so like it's coming from this outside perspective, but like it's important in like, you know, documenting, you know, what happened. And I think like knowing like horrible things that happen is like important. And I know there's like this large debate in like the education community now, right, with like, you know, a lot of bans and stuff like that, and efforts to ban things, but I do appreciate that can be traumatic for people as well, who are maybe more close to home with those concepts.
Yeah, and I think like that's, you know, this was probably like a similar critique of like, you know, historical like dramas and stuff back like in earlier years too. Like I would say like even in like Bush era stuff, right, where it's like black roles always tend to go towards like, you know, people who are enslaved, and like, you know, their depiction in film is like, you know, the atrocities of slavery. Yeah. And I think that was where like the big push for representation in media came from, right? Where it's like, can we have stories about us that have more to do with than just, you know, what happened to us in the past? But also, I think like you can't shy away from honest reckoning with the past. So I don't know. At least in my estimation, I think this film did a good job. But I think like, you know, that's an ongoing dialogue in
100%
film storytelling history that like it should always be paid attention to some extent. Performances and composition. I think everyone did a great job in the film. I don't think there was a single bad performance. Yeah. I think, you know, and you definitely had your criticisms of the composition. If you had to cut any arc, which one would you?
I don't know. I'm trying to like, it's like, as far as like the arcs, I mean, I think there's just like a few scenes that like kind of just don't go anywhere. Like there's one that like kind of stood out to me that like felt important when it happened, but didn't really materialize into anything. When King had Ernest sign like that document to like keep the rights within the family, like I assumed it was like some way to like surrender stuff to him, right? I thought it was like some advantage to him, but it just like nothing ever came of it. And like that scene was relatively lengthy too, and I think there's like a few scenes like that here and there where it's like they weren't essential to their arcs or anything like that.
Yeah. There were a couple scenes where I'm just like, the scene's going on, I wonder like what the use of this is. And I think part of it is like, you know, you want to paint like, you know, a historical like picture of like, you know, what was going on this time. And of course, like, you know, it's fun looking at all the old timey cars that go awooga when you hit the horn. But it got a bit excessive at a point. I'm just like, you know, you could at least shave off like 10 seconds here, 5 seconds here.
Sure, yeah.
But at the same time, you know, I'm definitely of the mind that if I enjoyed a film and a director said, no, I think this was absolutely necessary, you know, I'm definitely yes, sir, hoorah. But yeah, I think there was definitely like, you know, I would love to hear what the justification is for the length, but again, 4 hours, that is an interesting consideration.
Yeah, it's a commitment.
I think this is one thing that you mentioned we should add to the outline, and I've actually been looking forward to this.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
So this is a comparative politics idea, but it's a lot of people have been looking at applying it more domestically as well. And this is called it's from a book by Michael Ross called "The Oil Curse: How Petroleum Wealth Shapes the Development of Nations." the core thesis of this book is that countries that are like rich in petroleum specifically, but oil, like, you know, like oil and stuff like that, they have less democracy, less economic stability, and more frequent civil unrest, civil wars, things of that nature. And this has been applied to, like, you know, domestic contexts as well, like such as states, where we've seen, you know, like basically the argument is that like these countries, they have this wealth and they kind of, in part, they use it to sort of cow their citizenry a little bit, with things like subsidies or, you know, the head rights that we kind of see in this movie. And it was like one of these concepts that like being familiar with this, because I've reviewed like dozens of these capstone papers before, whether it's at like an undergraduate conference at Oakland, or some of my friends that have asked me to, like, you know, read their papers and whatnot and help them with it before as well. But this is it was just something that really stood out to me, like watching this. I was like, you know, like the whole, like the role that oil plays, and there's even a point in the movie where they literally do call it a curse, right? Like, so it's, you know, it's you know, in some ways maybe a little on the nose to make it this comparison, but I think, you know, it's worth kind of like, you know, as we've discussed already, a lot of like the themes of both in this movie and like some of the stuff that you kind of have to like research outside of that context, right? But you kind of get this sense that, like, you know, there is a lot of civil unrest in the sense that like they're being exploited, you know, by white men, and also in some cases, you know, like they're, you know, even their family is not exactly like sacred grounds, right? In terms of just being used to exploit them for their money.
Yeah, I think it's this thesis is definitely onto something, both in the context of the film and even when it comes to how we understand petrostates and how they function, right? You know, definitely like the Gulf monarchies this applies to.
And that's like explicitly what the book was like referring to, but like you can see it where like a lot of, like, you know, even like in the United States, right? Like states like Texas and whatnot are kind of subject to like these similar parameters as well.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, this kind of goes back to, I'm trying to remember what episode we talked about. What was it? The Yankee versus cowboy dynamic.
Yeah.
Where it's like, you know, you have the like the oil and mining, you know, capital from like the South and the Southwest influencing a certain kind of like evangelically influenced conservatism. Whereas, you know, like the Yankees in this factional setup, you know, they're involved in finance capital. They deal with international trade, so they tend to have a more moderate position when it comes to dealing with the communists. And the, you know, the Cowboys are more anti-communist in their posture, right? So I think they're definitely onto something there, right? And it's like, when you look at the context of this nationally, right? When I guess it is worth considering the Osage Murders and you know, the Tulsa Massacre as concurrent events rather than as separate ones, right? And especially, you know, you could probably add the Osage Murders to study when it comes to examining the Red Summer. And, you know, to that end too, like the Red Summer is even considered as, you know, a kind of wave or a response to the, you know, first wave of anti-communism in the US, right? If you take that for what it is, you know, like when we talk about the oil curse, right? I mean, if you're talking about the Gulf monarchies, you know, like they are staunchly right-wing states. They have, you know, regressive social policies, but also, you know, they facilitate certain anti-communist or certain, you know, anti-left objectives, you know, in the Middle East at, you know, America's discretion. They'll help America out on those fronts too. Venezuela comes to mind, but I think it's a bit of an outlier for this thesis. Do you know if it comes up in the book at all?
I do not know explicitly if Venezuela comes up, but yeah, that might be. But even then, right? Like, I mean, like some of these other concepts still kind of hold true for it, right? Like, I mean,
to some extent, for it, possibly, yeah. But yeah, for sure,
maybe
like
not explicitly because of the oil, but you know,
I mean, I mean, like, yeah, like Russia would even apply to a certain
Yeah.
extent. I'm trying to think like what other countries you could apply this to, right? Like, I mean, definitely the Gulf monarchies.
Yeah, those are I think the main focuses. But yeah, Russia 100% as well is like a 1-to-1 fit.
Yeah. And then like for sure, like in the U.S., I mean, it's definitely applicable to the U.S. I mean, the U.S. still produces oil to a
Yeah,
certain
even the
extent.
U.S. as a whole.
Yeah. Because again, it's like there has been an incursion of civil rights. There has been an incursion on democracy in the United States. Economic stability is, I mean, from the jump. I mean, isn't this movie like just a couple years shy of the Great Depression?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost right there. I mean, obviously, I would assume it hadn't happened yet. Otherwise, there would probably be a little bit more reference to it. But yeah, I mean, they're pretty darn close.
Yeah, so it's like even then, like economic stability is not a guarantee here in the United States, right? And then civil unrest. I mean, my God, this film was an example. Like you had the Osage Murders, the Tulsa Race Massacre was definitely civil unrest. Put that in the larger context of the Red Summer, just for the period of the film. Like I think this is a very cogent lens and political framework for understanding the events of the film, and then more broadly, how we read and digest the events of the Osage Murders here in the present. I think it definitely applies.
Yeah.
For sure, though, I think in the book, though, I wonder, like, are they talking about it in the sole context of nation states, or could you extrapolate that to, a criminal boss or in this case, a Democratic Party machine boss?
I mean, I think the book is mostly talking about nation states and whatnot, but a lot of scholars have extrapolated it to apply to smaller contexts, right? And I think that you could bring it into that case, right? Where like it's and I think it's not so much that it's like you have these the one party boss, right? It's like you have like again, there's like sort of this movement of murders that are occurring in this context. So it's not just the ones tied to like Molly's family in particular. There's other ones occurring, and I think that it's the idea. I think really is just kind of that like the oil is sort of inviting it's sort of inviting greed that's sort of take root and take a hold there in various shapes and forms. Whether it be through like a mob boss or, other folks who are trying to directly capitalize on it.
I think, Michael Ross may not have been trying to make an artistic gesture here, but calling it a curse is pretty accurate, because if you think about like oil as a concept, right? Like it's a totalizing thing, like we became an oil dependent economy. You get carbon, our whole foreign policy being structured off of that. Yeah. And even in the film, like it's depicted as like this like ethereal, like black substance, that looks scary. And then isn't there that one scene where like the oil workers are like covered in it and they look kind of like monstrous looking at that
was like a really weird and kind of random scene, but
because they witness a murder,
and like nothing happens from it. I wasn't even sure. I'm like, are these like actually oil workers? Or are they like the spirits of the dead? Or like I didn't know what the artistic purpose of them was. But I do remember that.
Yeah, I mean for sure, like it works artistically, and it also works just again like in a political economic understanding. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah,
it would definitely be a missed opportunity to mention this. And this I think was like the one bit of my extended reading that really shocked me. I don't know if they mentioned this in the ending of the film or not, But um, William Hale entered Fort Leavenworth Federal Prison
Yeah.
1929, and over the protests of the Osage, was paroled in 1947. Ernest Burkhart was released in 1959, and in 1966 was given a full pardon by the governor of Oklahoma.
Yeah. I think most of that was mentioned in the little epilogue thing. I don't remember if the pardon was explicitly mentioned, and I tried to look into it because I was like really curious. I'm like, okay, like
same, yeah.
what was the I'm like, was this a governor who had like, was he like firm like anti-native sentiment or anything like that? And I couldn't find anything about that.
Yeah, the closest I could find out about Henry Bellman, who was the governor who gave the pardon, is like, I think he started off as this like, you know, very harsh, arch conservative segregationist type, and then as soon as he starts making it to the national scale, I think he becomes senator from Oklahoma at some point.
Yeah,
and immediately pivots to the center, like starts becoming a moderating influence. So I'm not sure what to make of that. You'd probably have to like look up like local papers to try to make heads and tails of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. He's not someone who has like a lot out there about him, at least on like, you know, the more obvious channels. Which is a bit of a shame because I was interested in that because I was like, I just don't see the grounds to like pardon someone involved with this. And that was pardoning too because he went back to prison actually, because he had like robbed I think his sister-in-law's home.
God, this guy was a crook till the end.
Yeah. There's also, I think this is in the book. I had read this detail. Apparently, like when he died, he wanted like his ashes spread over like the Osage Plains, and instead his son like just tossed it over a bridge.
Looks like justice was served after all.
Right. In a very menial, kind of petty way, but you know, sometimes you got to do what you got to do. You got to settle.
Carry out your last rites. What are you gonna do? Me? Oh gosh. All right. We have been at this for like about 2 hours now. Is there any other angle or anything we might have missed?
You know, I mean, obviously, you know, we're an hour short of the movie, at least. But I can't. Nothing's really coming to my mind that we've missed.
Yeah, I think you know, since this is movie magic, we got to give it our final rating. So, I think we're doing out of 5, or did we do out of 10? I can't remember.
You know,
we change the metric every time.
Ask you what you do for this.
I mean, if it's out of 5 and then it's out of 10 for some, divide by 2, I guess. But yeah, out of 5, what would you give this one?
I think I'd give it a 4. Pretty good, but I think there's like, you know, the length and a few other things kind of hold it back from like that, you know, that true greatness.
Yeah, I think I give it a 4.5. You know,
okay.
I will admit my bias as a Scorsese true believer, but you know, I think it was very prescient and necessary for the current moment we're in.
Sure.
And it was it brought a lot to the surface that I was thinking about that I wasn't able to put words to until I saw the film. And I think good cinema has that power to help you make sense of a story, but also bring, you know, the refreshing perspective of you know, well put together art back into your life. I don't necessarily know if everyone's going to see it that way, but I definitely think this is probably another example of cinema being back in a big way this year. And I think, you know, again, with Oppenheimer and with this film, it's been a good year
Barbie.
for yeah, even Barbie too, right? Like it's been a good year for movies, right? Yeah. And I'm again, if this is a sign of anything to come, I'm fighting allergies here. I'm really excited for Napoleon now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Apple TV Productions, whatever they're doing something good.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So with all that being said, thanks for tuning in, dear listeners. Josh, do you have anything you want to plug?
Not today. I think we'll keep it as short and sweet as we can.
Yeah, as always, I've got all the stuff in the description below. You know where to find it. If you don't know how to see the description, go to your podcast app. You'll see a tab that says See More. It'll pop up. It's all on Linktree. Till next time, dear listeners, take care.